4 o'clock, I'd like to call the special board and education and business committee meeting for Tuesday, April 14th to order. And the first item of business is to adopt the agenda. Is there a mover and a seconder for the agenda? Joanne and Barb. You don't have to move out of it.
All right, I'll move back.
We'll get seasick if you keep doing that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All those in favor? Anybody opposed? Motion is carried. Over to business and operations, 2020-2021 annual budget. Jason.
Thank you. I'm just going to load the PowerPoint here.
Now, Jason does have a spot at the end of the PowerPoint for questions, but just feel free to raise your hand, and I'm sure he'll take questions. Hopefully you all had a chance to read the draft PowerPoint. It's a pretty thorough document.
Okay, so with that, I'll begin to proceed with the 2020-21 annual budget presentation. I want to start by talking about budgeting in a COVID-19 context. We've been thinking about what some of the implications may be. Certainly, just for summary purposes, on March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared a COVID-19 a pandemic. The Ministry of Education established 4 guiding principles, and we know these quite well: health and safety, essential service workers, vulnerable populations, and ongoing learner supports. And currently, our operations
Jason,
Yep.
We don't see your PowerPoint. We just see the agenda.
You can't see the PowerPoint, but you can see the agenda?
We cannot see the PowerPoint. We just have the agenda.
Hang on. Got the wrong one then. Sorry. Thank you for correcting. Can we now?
Hey, perfect.
Thank you. Well, I guess I have to come out of a share and go back into another share. So yeah, and so I just wanted to start with the slide to know that, and on my screen, if I move the people over, does that also? No.
Good, we can see you.
Okay. So we know that our current expenditure levels have been significantly altered by COVID-19, as our operation has been significantly altered. So there are many estimates as to how long this pandemic will continue to affect our society, but I think from everything that we know, it's certain that in some capacity it will affect the school district's finances into the next year. Oops, one second. Okay, so some considerations as we move into the budget. And we've talked about some of these briefly already. Would be what are the impact or questions and considerations? What will be the impact on our international student program revenues and expenditures? And we have made some alterations to the opening revenue position, which we'll get to a little bit later in this presentation. What will absenteeism look like into next year? Will we expect to see an increase in absenteeism or in sick leave coverage as waves of COVID come into the system? Or what if we're not in full operation again by September, or we have another situation where we are having students learning in a not in class environment throughout next year? That would be the opposite effect of actually reducing absenteeism replacement budgets. What will be custodial requirements as we move into the next year? You know, certainly our cleaning standards are very, very high regularly, but will have to be even higher. How will COVID-19 affect our surplus estimate? And the board has seen an estimate, and I'll get into that later in the slides as well, around our surplus projections for this year and how they've been impacted by COVID-19. Investment revenues, there was about a 50% drop in the board's interest revenue that the board receives for, I guess they're funds that we have in the bank that are in excess of our operating requirements. So things like reserves, surpluses, funding that we receive in advance of projects, etc. So that's already down, and we factor that into our opening position. Enrollment estimates. Will we see fewer students as some parents may adjust to the homeschooling that they're currently participating in? Will we see higher number of students as certain families that were previously paying for private education may wish to come into the public system based on the cost of those private opportunities? Things just to be thinking about. And then staffing levels. At this point, we don't have direction to provide services into July and August, but traditionally we're closed during those months. But will we still be, as we go back to the essential service worker slide, will we still be providing supports for essential service workers into the summer months? That's an unknown. So just wanted to highlight some of those items that are affecting the budget for 2020-2021 due to COVID-19. This is just a slide that we typically show you at this time, just to set the background on the budget, that we are currently in the 2019-2020 year. What we know is that our enrollment that we would normally be counting for in May has been fixed based on our estimates. So that is enrollment that we would typically receive for dual credit or DL opportunities. So we got our February count and it was higher than anticipated, and usually our May count is higher than anticipated, but the May count will be what we actually submitted. So it's a relatively flattening line on our enrollment projections as we move forward, but for an important part is that 2020-2021 right now isn't projected to be very much higher than the current year. How is the school district funded? Certainly our provincial grant is the primary source of funding, and if we didn't have local education agreements, the blue bar would also include this gold colored slice. So this is also per pupil based funding, local education agreements plus the provincial grant. So really 97% of the board's funding comes in from the per pupil piece. Some's generated from international student program, and then our other revenues being investment and rentals, etc. So the point of this slide is to show you the big piece of the pie is from our student counts. How allocated? Focusing on instruction as the major piece of the budget pie, operations and maintenance being the next piece, and then we see district administration and transportation there. And then I think this is pretty common. Typically we're between 89 and 90% wages and benefits as we look over the past decade. Pretty consistent distribution among most school districts in the province. You can see what we spend on services, which would be sort of our dual credit tuition, contracts, etc. Supplies, if you don't know what supplies are, maintenance, custodial, school supplies, utilities being our heat and utilities, etc. So I want to talk about the fact that the budget is a very dynamic document. It's constantly changing as the board knows, as we move through our adoption phases, the one we do now and the one we do in February. But even during the budget development process, so there's even information that we will likely receive from now to the time that the board adopt this budget. So some of the preliminary estimate that we've prepared does include or does not include certain pieces of information. So right now we do not know the benefit rates for teachers and principals. We've just rolled them over as they were for this current year. But it's important to note that the support staff benefits this is for extended health and dental, increased by $153,000 year over year. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the teachers and principals will be high, but when you look at our absenteeism rate, and if those are a factor of the health of our staff, we could expect to see that the previous year, the usage of those benefits would be higher and therefore translating into the next year's premiums. So we'll see how that comes out. The effects of a tentative collective agreement for teachers. We're not getting into any of the details of that agreement here, but as it has not been ratified, we are not expected to include it in our budget at this time. And the offsetting revenue has also not been included. There's some of the effects of COVID-19 that we talked about that have not been included in the opening position, but we'll hopefully pick up some of those through the budget cycle. And the effects of a recent change in funding policy for dual credit students that have graduated from K-12 the prior year. So we in the past have been able to claim tuition for graduated students to provide them, assist them with their opportunities for some of their first year courses or trades programs before they're 19 years old. And that policy has been changed, and we are working through what the implications of that would be. There's also tuition that goes out, and in many cases it's a 1-for-1 ratio. So we're not sure whether or not at this time there's a financial impact, but we bring it up here for one of our unknowns at the moment. So when we do that and we roll over our revenues that we've adjusted and we roll over our expenses.
Sorry, Joanne, are you asking a question or?
No, sorry, I'm just trying to make my screen bigger.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So when we roll it all over, all things being equal, by making some of our revenue adjustments, adjusting for the new funding announcement that we reviewed at the last board meeting, certainly removing the surplus that we had rolled over the previous year and in making some adjustments, we fall short of balancing by $2,163,000 as a starting position. And there's some key reasons for that, and I just put 4 of them there. There's many, many more, but the big one was we balanced off the year using $1.6 million in prior year surplus. And actually, we used more than that because we had to borrow from our surplus because we hadn't had it announced it for the funding. So actually, it's a little bit higher than that. Or sorry, the funding for the support staff wage increases. Our benefit rates increased for support staff. We dropped by 50% our investment revenues, and we've already made some adjustments to reduce our international program revenues based on expectations for the next year. So here's where we get into the various options. And you'll see here, this might look kind of weird. We're starting with the negative. So as I make corrections to that negative, they're going to appear in positive, even though they're potentially revenues or expenditure reductions, because they're going to assist in reducing that shortfall. I added these cool effects. So if we appropriate from that surplus that we showed the board at the last board meeting, 1.2 million, and I'll have another slide on surplus a little bit later, that would help to offset that shortfall or that starting position. And we weren't expecting to have this level of surplus when we were 2 months ago. That really came about as a result of COVID-19 and some of the budgets that currently aren't being expended, like replacement budgets for absenteeism, or sorry, I just got conversation with somebody distracted me. So things like our in-service budgets or our bus fuel, those have all contributed back to the surplus. We also looked at appropriating some funds that have been accumulating in the international liability accounts, bringing those into budget. And those are from medical premiums that had been charged where we had gone with a private provider when MSP had waived the fees and resulted in some surplus accumulation. So bringing those 2 items in leaves us with a shortfall of $763,108. And now moving into some of the expenditure reductions. First one, we can make some reductions to staffing levels within the international student program, and we can do that because the student numbers have dropped as well. Probably the largest item that can be considered is to look at a closer alignment of our teaching staffing ratios to the collective agreement. So the collective agreement, when it was restored 3 years ago through the Supreme Court of Canada decision, provided the board or provided the restoration of a number of ratios. And Some ratios were maintained at their previous levels, so they were higher than what was required in the collective agreement, resulting in over expenditures, not over expenditures, I shouldn't use that as a term, resulting in higher than required levels of supports. And so we know that that's an area that we have an opportunity to look at for reductions. And hence we have a collective agreement alignment that would result in about 10 FTE.
Maybe you should phone them.
The other item is when we are budgeting for our starting position, we use a very, quite a sophisticated budgeting program, and it looks at our actual people. So we have each individual by name, by position, by FTE in our budget program, and we're as specific as knowing where a teacher is on their increment step, which month they're going to move, and whether or not they are receiving benefit rates that would be at a family or couple or single rate. So we have our expenditures budgeted, very, very finely. And when we roll all that over to the next year, we're rolling over our current complement of teaching staff. And so what always seems to happen is that we have a number of retirements at the end of a year or a number of leave replacements that may occur throughout the year, resulting in somebody who was at the top end of the pay scale, maybe 610, leaving and being replaced typically by somebody who's at the lower end of the pay scale, a newer teacher. And the difference between a newer teacher and a senior teacher can be as much as $30,000. So it doesn't take too many retirements before you have some reduction to your overall salary. And hence we know that every year we can comfortably bring in a slight reduction on that after we've moved everybody forward. And so after all that, it's a positive number. So this would mean there's $649,000 to apply towards some increased expenditure areas. Here I bring forward a comment that negative numbers are budgets that are increasing to expend the budgeted surplus. So as it shows as the negative, it's actually something that we would be adding into the budget. So items for consideration are to look at absenteeism coverage. We were heading towards a significant overrun in that budget this year prior to COVID. Last estimate was close to $750,000. So certainly if you average out the last few years, it may be appropriate to look at increasing that budget, and particularly in a COVID-19 context where we had the potential for more absenteeism due to the virus into the next year. So we're suggesting a 10% addition there, which is pretty significant. That's actually a lot of money to be allocating into absenteeism. And that's not just for teachers, that would be for across the workforce. Custodial supplies, knowing that, as we move into more sophisticated cleaning products to ensure that we're doing our best to disinfect the workspaces, certainly suggesting that those are more expensive and that we may need to consider some funding additions there. Strategic plan activation with the 2020-2024 newly adopted board strategic plan. There are 4 key areas within that plan, and they'll be highlighted on a slide shortly after this, that need to be activated and acted on. Bus mechanic, we are aware that we have had increasingly costly repairs on our buses that require us hiring, I guess not really, I'm not saying we're not contracting out, but they've required the assistance of external supports due to our mechanics levels. And we believe that by restoring a third mechanic, which we used to have, we'd be able to offset many of those future high-end cost repairs. Basically doing the maintenance now to not pay for the big bills later. Another item here is it's expected that the Provincial Sector Employers Council will provide for increases for principal, vice principals that align with those of the teachers as of previous years. So as that agreement gets ratified, which we hope will be ratified provincially and by all parties shortly, those percentage increases that the teachers will receive will be eligible for the principal vice principal group. So we're just suggesting that figure be considered. And then the last item I have here so far on the first round of options is to look at adding back some time into elementary principal admin time. There are currently 3 of the elementary schools that operate with less than 1.0 administrator. We had committed last year to begin to restore those in 0.1 increments at those schools. And so this increase of 0.3 FTE, teacher time, because that gives back the admin time, provides for all but one now to hit the 1.0. So after all of that, we would still be overexpended by $101,441. So we'll certainly have more options in the future. And I don't know if this is a time to pause on those in case there's any questions. Share if you'd like me to proceed, or pause for trustee questions, or stop a share so you can see some hands.
Thanks, Jason. You don't have to, I can see hands.
Okay.
Any questions? Sorry, Elizabeth? You have to demute.
There, unmute. I certainly understand the need for a bus mechanic. I just wonder if we're not running buses next fall, are we going to have to back away from that? I know it's unlikely.
Jason?
Yeah, I think that's I think what we're having to also look at, when that request went in, it was before we were shut down like we are now. I'll have to have further conversations with the transportation department and to find out, are we catching up on some of those mechanics this year, or some of those mechanical adjustments this year as we're no longer running the buses right now? It might be that we're actually, some of that deferred maintenance is happening today. So we'll have more information on that option as we move forward. It was just something I had early on the report that I delivered in February.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions by trustees at this time? Joe?
Yeah, Jason, I'm shaking, but I'm thinking of the students that are going to be going back to homeschool. A lot of them won't have laptops, iPads. A lot of them won't have Wi-Fi. I see the value in having a third mechanic because we need that to keep away from the big bills. And I thought we had come to some kind of conclusion for the absentee. It's vaguely in the back of my mind, so you may have to bring me up to date. I'm looking at the reality, and I kind of think I know we're going to have to go next year for a budget, and I don't like it, but it's a reality that we're going to have to face. That's my question and my points.
Jason, can you help?
So the question was around absenteeism, I believe, and around technology requirements.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think on the tech side, what we're currently doing is redeploying technology that would have existed in the schools out to those students that required it. So at this time, we haven't considered the need to purchase more. We have a fair bit at the schools sites. When it comes to absenteeism, we would all like to be seeing that number go down, but I think it's more of a contingency item right now as we are budgeting in a COVID-19 context to put some money aside there. It doesn't mean that it will be expended, but what it does do is provide that coverage in the event that we end up operating through cycles of COVID-19 that affect certain components of our staff where we have to be paying for their replacement. So this would assume that we have students back in schools. So I think it's an important contingency, and I'm hopeful that with our wellness program, we see our absenteeism rates go down overall. But it's at this point, it's a recommendation to add to that budget.
Yeah, and I guess my big concern is around the slow learn, the kids that are hard to learn, slow learners, I guess you'd call them. And I think for some of the dual credit, it'd be nice if Larry and I both had a Zoom conversation with Tom to talk about, he did mention the hospital as well as the high school. I think we got opportunity there. We could we could actually get something out of it.
Okay.
I don't know how Larry feels. I haven't talked to him as yet.
Thank you. Candace?
I was just, I thought I heard you say you were going to go over the strategic plan activation plan.
So I have the 4 items that are part of that plan, but I don't specifically have the plan developed yet. We're just at this time suggesting some funding to support the activation. And when we come back with more detailed analysis of each of these options at the next meeting, we'll hopefully have that in place.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
I think I'll proceed out of here. I want to talk a bit about the surplus. So this is something new that we haven't added to previous year's slides. And to start out by defining what our budget is, and you can see I've highlighted a definition there. It's an estimate, often itemized, of expected income and expenses for a given period of time. And I think the key is that it's an estimate. And we find ourselves in one of 3 positions. We always hope to find ourselves in the first one that I've listed here, which is revenues have exceeded expenditures and have a surplus. The odds of revenues equaling expenditures, option number 2, are almost nil. And option number 3, revenue less than expenditures, that's a deficit position for which we're not permitted to operate within, and we never want to find ourselves there. So it means that we budget in a manner, hopefully to land as close as we can to that balanced position, but always in the surplus position. If we get too close to the line on our budget line items, we run the risk of landing in the deficit position. So throughout the year, there's always unforeseen circumstances, and I just wanted to highlight it. And we never would have thought that COVID-19 would be where we're at right now. And of course, that's had some significant impact on our current year's finances. When we last presented the surplus projection to the board on April 7th, we showed you a potential surplus, of course it's projected, of 1.585 million. That was over and above what the board had already in surplus that was left over after the 2019-2020 amended annual budget was adopted. And so when that's added to the $816,000, we end up with roughly 2.4 million that we're projecting to be the surplus at the end of the year. Now that 1.5, we'll get a lot better handle on that after our April 15th payroll occurs. So we want to do one more revenue projection, or one more year-end projection before really committing that that $1.2 million is a solid amount to bring in from surplus into the balancing position. So I just wanted to highlight that. So the board does have a policy, and that is to maintain a contingency or unrestricted surplus. I'm going to call them the same. I'm going to give them both those names. It is both of those things. An unrestricted surplus is the board's contingency of equal to 1 to 3% of the operating budget. So on an $87.3 million operating budget, that range of 1 to 3% is equal to $873,000 to 2.6 million. So that's a range of funding that your policy suggests that you maintain. And that's also consistent with best practices from the Ministry of Education. So to bring in 1.2 million of that 2.4 would leave a projected unrestricted surplus of 1.2 million, or equivalent to 1.4% of the budget. The following really right in the middle, or well, actually closer to the bottom end of that, but still providing some room if something doesn't happen due to COVID-19 that we hadn't anticipated. Some just sort of a visual here. We can want to show you what we've used at budget time to balance from surplus, which is the blue line, and you can see that it kind of went up a few years ago, and now it's going down, which is meaning we're getting closer to not relying on surplus to help balance. But we don't plan to have surpluses of this size when we are budgeting. The yellow line is what was left over in contingency. So we're still looking at a pretty solid contingency as far as matching the board's 1 to 3%. So I just wanted to give you this slide as an example, as a visual of where we've been over the last 5 years. So how will decisions on balancing the budget be made? The survey is out now. I think as you may know from our revised timeline, that will close on April 19th, and then we'll have a few days to get that together before bringing that to the BEBC on April 23rd. The partner group meetings are scheduled for April 21st, of course, now through Zoom. Public can always comment through the website. We're looking at alignment to the strategic plan and the budget guiding principles that were adopted. We are talking about bringing in a surplus from the 2019-2020 year, which will be the largest revenue addition. And there are also areas of the budget where additional resources could be directed to focus on the board for strategic priorities. So we're suggesting at this time, from the implementation plan, $150,000 to assist in that work. So there's the 4 priorities. Just copying that out of the strategic plan, just to keep in mind learning, Indigenous ways of knowing, cultural care, and future focus systems. Coming to the Classroom Enhancement Fund, I've broken it into 2 sections for this presentation, and we all know the first part of this slide, that the collective agreement language with the teachers and school districts was restored in the fall of 2016, and then there was a memorandum of agreement. And government had committed to funding that memorandum of agreement. But what they've done in their first funding allocation for next year's budget is they reduced the overall funding from $446 million to $400 million for Classroom Enhancement Fund implementation. Now, this is outside of the remedy piece. It's just the piece around teachers and the overhead component. And so when they made that reduction, they have dropped all of our allocations by 10%. And it doesn't mean that we won't receive $7.8 million if we spend $7.8 million on teachers. It just means that they have only committed a portion of that at this time. And they did this a couple of years ago as well. So our funding for teaching levels has been reduced from 7.8 million to just under 7.1 million. And that's just the initial draft. They'll need to revisit that in the fall if our actual costs differ.
Jason,
Mm-hmm.
I thought that the new agreement between the teachers and the government would have resolved.
Got feedback.
Is this not going to go away with the new agreement?
Well, I think until that's ratified, that's still in camera. But at this time, I would suggest that I don't not believe that that's going to go away with the new agreement.
Wow. Thank you. Candace?
Can I just follow up on that and ask if you've looked into how that will impact directly on our operation?
Yeah, I mean, it's an initial allocation by government. The commitment is still there to fully fund the teachers. It just means they have to go back and get additional funding from Treasury to do that. And I believe they've just been very conservative in their initial allocation, which is what they did a couple of years ago. It allows them to budget within their framework. I don't think there'll be an impact on this component because they've committed to fully funding the teachers. I'm more worried about the next slide. The overhead fund. And so this one also saw a drop of 10%. And the overhead are the costs related to implementing the agreement, where this year we received $893,000. Remember, this has been a high of almost 1.2 million. And so what the funding model is showing right now is our share will be 877, which is about another 10% drop. I'm not sure this will be restored come the fall. I'm thinking it's just the teachers piece. So we're going to need to budget within the context of the expectation that $877,000 is what we'll receive for overhead for the next year. And that covers off our sick leave replacement costs for the teachers that are in the Classroom Enhancement Fund, some professional development funds, because in the restored agreement, we're to provide professional development for teachers that have students with designations in their classrooms. And we've used the funding as well with ministry approval to fund almost 14 education assistants. So one of the recommendations that we've had now that it appears that our remedy is not going away, and here's where I'm sort of putting my prediction here. Remedy will be with us for a while, as will be the number of teachers that we have put into the system based on the restored language, and education assistants that have come into the system based on the restored language. Is that we really need assistance in the human resource department to keep up with this additional workload. And so we've recommended that as that workload was caused by the restored language, that it be funded from the funding that's received for the restored language. So we're recommending a redistribution of those funds up above to assist with a junior level exempt human resource position. And also wanted to talk that this is a special purpose fund. It's outside of the operating fund, and it's in place to assist with the incremental costs associated with implementing the memorandum of agreement. So I'm going to move on. So we know that schools filled up when we had the restored collective agreement language significantly, and the board is expected to manage those space requirements now within their own operating budgets. The first year we received some funding, but that only addressed the 1 year, 2017, 2018. And so we have to do things like reinstate classrooms that are leased to third parties, such as daycare operators. So prioritize those for learning spaces. Look at catchment areas if we have requirements, adjust grade configurations and programming, and the board has done that with the Norse implementation this year, and reopen closed facilities, which you did with Mill Bay. So we know for next year that one of our schools cannot be reconfigured in any way, and requires the movement of 2 portables to accommodate a bubble of students that's coming in. So we'll be looking at accessing some of our annual facilities grant to assist with those 2 moves, and that should estimate, the estimated cost is about $80,000. So that's more of a capital budget preview for you. There are 3 other significant special purpose funds. The Learning Improvement Fund is back again, and that's a fund that provides additional education assistant supports in classrooms. It's predominantly used to provide an hour a week for education assistants to work together or work with their teachers. I'll go to the next one, Community Link funding. We need to do, I think, committed to doing a review of this budget during this budget process. So we'll have to come back with some recommendations there. I guess a concern is that this budget is in place to really support our, some of our vulnerable students, and it's a significant budget for providing our school meal supports. And I'm wondering about what the effects of our economic downturn based on COVID-19, or the effects that's going to have on the number of students needing to access these programs. And so I think we really have to think about how to use these funds to support the most students in that way. And currently we spend about 2-to-1 people to food ratio in the food program. So I'm just kind of giving a hint that I think that's somewhere that we need to be thinking about. Can we deliver those programs in a way that most optimizes the ability to provide the most food and other supports? The last item is the annual facility grant, and it is pretty much what it was this year. That's our special purpose fund that keeps our buildings with painting and roofing and window replacements, etc. And so the next steps would be, we had to cancel the public meeting that would normally be scheduled for 5:30 p.m. on April 20th. I think it was 20th, or was it 21st originally? I might have the wrong date up there. Anyway, it's been canceled. The budget survey is going to be closing on April 19th, so it's going to be out for 11 days. We released it a little bit later than originally planned to I guess, not overwhelm families or parents with responding to it while they were still dealing very much with the learning plans for their children. And we'll bring the summary of those results to the April 23rd Special Board Education and Business meeting. We'll continue to work on developing options to reduce the shortfall to bring to the board. I mean, at this time, we don't have more options than we have shortfall. So we need to be looking at that. There so far isn't really a slate of options to choose from. We'll continue to work together. It's pretty tight. We will hopefully have, after the April 28th Board Education and Business Committee, the regular one, some direction that the budget is balanced with the information that we have at that time so that staffing can proceed both for CUPE, or not both for CUPE, steelworkers, and teachers, as we have collective agreement timelines that still need to be considered. We will wait for confirmation on our costume enhancement fund submission to the ministry to see if they adjust our budget component before adopting the budget. So that means the first and second reading of the budget would normally take place on June 2nd at our regular board meeting. And then after reflection, we would do the third and final reading at a special meeting a little bit later in June. And this is the section where I have questions from trustees, and I'll stop the share so we can all see each other.
Thanks, Jason. My first question to you is the $10 or $1 million regarding matching our, I forget the phraseology.
More closely aligning to the collective agreement ratios.
Yeah, is that to do with our structural deficit? Is that another way of expressing the structural deficit issue?
Yeah, it's an area that we have expended. And again, I know it's always have to caution ourselves when we compare to other school districts, but it's an area where we have maintained supports that others have not been able to maintain for this long.
Okay, thank you. Questions of Jason? Joanne? You're on mute, Dion.
Of course I was. Is the Learning Improvement Fund the same as last year, or is it a little bit less?
It's pretty much the same. It's population based. So it's just based on how it may flex by a few $1,000s up or down, but it's essentially the same. We would expect to have the exact same program in place with it next year after we consult with CUPE.
Okay.
Candace?
A couple of questions, Jason. The first is regarding the board's strategic priorities funding. And when you described it, you talked about also diverting implementation funds possibly. Are those going to add up to 300,000 then in terms of shifting priorities toward that? Or is it 150,000 and some of it from implementation funds? I'm just a little confused on that.
No, it's $150,000 that we've set aside for the strategic plan in total at this point, implementation.
So current resourcing to implementation will not be affected then? Okay. Thank you. My second question is around the staffing processes will begin before the board has actually given first and second reading. Are these temporary staffing processes where no final decisions are made, or it just
They're fine. They're final.
earlier?
They're final. So what we're really looking for at the end of April is endorsement from the BEDC that the budget is substantially complete enough to proceed with those staffing levels, that those staffing levels will not change between that time and June when the budget's adopted. Last time a couple of years ago, we adopted the budget right at May in order to formally have those in place. And then we had to redo our budget again in June because the ministry said we hadn't locked down your special purpose fund dollars yet. And so we can't really adopt it until the ministry fully confirms what they're going to fund us for the Classroom Enhancement Fund teachers. And so what we're looking for is some direction from the committee that the budget is balanced and waiting, but that we need that authority to move ahead with those staffing levels at that time, or we won't meet our collective agreement timelines.
Thank you.
We did it by a motion last year.
Any other questions of Jason? Claire, I noticed on the side there, beside your muted button, you've got a red eye looking thing. I'm not sure what that means.
There was a comment, not really a question, from Richard Dybel that said, "Thank you, Candace and all the trustees for your happy Easter message. Very appreciated and thoughtful. In strange times like this, it is nice to see such positive messaging. Thank you."
Okay, so that red eye looking thing was a message. Okay, thank you. Any other questions of Jason? Trustee Thorne?
Yeah, well, we'll be talking about the lunch programs in another meeting because that really concerns me. And any idea from what province is doing for our internationals, because that's another biggie. Those two things are really stick out in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Well, our community link budget is where majority of our meal funds come from. So I know that we need to bring some recommendations, and I'm hoping we can do that. Western staff get through a review by the next BEBC meeting. With international, we certainly have a lot of questions ourselves about what that's going to look like for next year, or even continuing through the summer. Some of the students may not be able to go home, and what opportunities will we need to put in place to keep them busy through the months of July and August as well. So I guess that's one of our risk areas. There's a lot of unknowns, which is why I think it's important to maintain a solid contingency. Hence why we're not recommending going further than that $1.2 million as a balancing amount to bring in until we do another projection. Because I think, with 1% being the target, that's about $900,000, not being the target, being the low end of the target as far as contingency. That still sort of leaves that buffer of 300-ish in there for those unknowns that might happen.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, seeing no more hands are up. Any other business at this time, Jason?
No more business. I'll just return us to the agenda.
So is there a motion to adjourn? Barb DeGroot, seconded by Joe Thorne. All those in favor? Okay, we'll see everybody on Thursday, I believe.